So I'm Mike Racine, and it's my pleasure to talk today on what's for dinner. They say you're not supposed to start a talk out with any sort of an apology for the talk itself. So I'm here pointedly not apologizing for kind of a plain Jane title and sort of no title screen at all. But maybe if we put it online, maybe we'll have something by that time for the YouTube. A few minutes ago, we sang "The God of Breakthroughs is on our side." And those words sort of struck me a little bit because of the fact that this talk is sort of about a breakthrough that God engineered, I would say, in my mind over the last, over my whole life, I guess, but most particularly the last 10, 15 years. And so he's indeed the God of breakthroughs. And what I want to talk about today is really kind of about my journey in regards to health and nutrition particularly, but it's my journey, and nothing in what I'm saying is really intended to tell anybody else what they ought to do or what they need to do or what they should have done. None of that is intended or useful at all. So, but I find this topic a fascinating topic in the way that my thinking has changed over the last 10, 15 years about health. And I might say that just as a preview, 15 years is only about half of my medical professional career. And so I was well into medicine before these changes came to my mind. But what's for dinner? So that's me in the middle there, and this is in the fall of 1989. And there's another picture of me from that same year that I wanted to find because it is a lot goofier than this one. This photo almost gets it, but so this was for the annual beginning of the year identification book at the college I went to. So, kind of an informal picture. And then of course you get your photo taken for the annual at the end of the year, and that's where you put your makeup on and everything else, and it's a nice color photo. But that photo that I wanted to find was the one that I wanted to show you because it illustrates pretty well this funny story that I want to share. It was that school year that a girl that I had known for 3 or 4 years, she went to the same high school as I did. She was a couple years younger than I was or am. And she said to me, and we were friendly acquaintances, we weren't close friends, but she said to me, Mike, you just look more feminine this year. And so that's one of the memorable things from my third year of college. I did, it was 1989, so a lot of guys had sort of longer, fuller hair on top. It wasn't really a bush or a bowl cut, but it was something like that. Anyway, thank goodness for the passage of time. But so I was at Pacific Union College there, and I was majoring in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry. And just for fun, I wanted to show you some of the fun stuff that we got to learn. If you've had any education at all in healthcare or in health or in cellular biology, you'll know something about this. And that's these are two processes inside our cells that have to do with how our bodies acquire energy from the food we eat. And just for fun, we have something called glycolysis. Maybe you pronounce it glycolysis. You can't see it, but up here at the top is glucose, which our cells absorb from our bloodstream, right? Our cells prefer glucose for fuel, I should mention. And anyway, the glucose is broken down through a whole bunch of steps, 10 steps. It's split into two molecules, and then both of those molecules go into the mitochondria of our cells, where it waltzes its way around this thing called the TCA cycle, the tricarboxylic acid cycle. And believe me, I'm not using long words to impress anybody, because I'm convinced that every one of us in our own fields has inside language and lingo that we can use that other people would be like, what is that? I don't know anything about a differential, And so, but this was some of the language that I learned in college. And I went on from there, and just a brief sketch of my education, again, only because I want to highlight the fact that I went through all this fancy training and thought one way, and then sometime later, the God of breakthroughs, I guess, affected me. So I earned my BS in chemistry in 1991, and then I finished medical school at Loma Linda in 1995. I stayed at Loma Linda for my residency, which was 4 more years of combined internal medicine and pediatrics training, and then realized that that was too broad for my feeble mind, and I focused in on endocrinology training, which I completed 4 years later at the University of Michigan in 2003. And so ever since 2003, I've been an endocrinologist and see more diabetes than anything else. You know, we see a lot of different kinds of problems, but must be 60+% of the patients I see have diabetes, usually type 2, but I have a lot of kids with type 1. And I had been an endocrinologist for a number of years before this breakthrough. Now, before I move on to that, let me not get ahead of myself. I want to remind you that when I earned my MD degree, I joined a large number of people around the planet that included gentlemen like this. 20,679 physicians say Luckies are less irritating because it's toasted. These are toasted cigarettes, evidently. Your throat protection against irritation, against cough. Well, 20,000 physicians can't possibly be wrong. This is some kind of a magazine ad from the 50s or 40s, perhaps. And then you've got this distinguished-looking gentleman with the white lab coat, which of course signals that he can't be wrong. God bless him. And it says here, not one single case of throat irritation due to smoking Camels. And if you could read the fine print, you know, they make all sorts of lovely claims. Some really beautiful people here, and they smoke cigarettes, and so you're likely to be beautiful too if you smoke cigarettes. And the physician can practically guarantee it. And one more here, in case you're uncertain, that more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, and so really you ought to also. And so times changed in the 60s, right? The Surgeon General came out with a report that to Americans was sort of a lightning bolt, and it said that smoking causes lung cancer, and of course we all know that. It's second nature now. But I want to point out the fact that I work as a professional just like these guys, if they're real doctors and not just paid advertisers. The point is that your physician is very often right and not always right, and it's helpful to do one's own work, isn't it? So, okay, back to my story. So in probably about 2010, at the church that I was attending in Michigan, before I had met Olia, actually, on a Wednesday night, I was asked to give a little talk on nutrition. And so I dutifully pulled up what was then the current healthy food pyramid, and presented it with an air of knowledge, right? And we talked about how 40% of energy should come from essentially carbohydrates and 35% from fruits and vegetables. And I made a point of saying that we need to eat our meat and eat our fish particularly, and drink our milk, and then avoid too much sugar and things. So it went fine. People accepted that, But there was one man in the audience at that church, a guy named Jeff Proxmire. And Jeff was a very friendly guy. He came up to me. He was about my age, I think. He's a little younger, probably. He came up to me and he said, hey, have you heard of, there's this book I wonder if you've heard of. It's called The China Study. The China Study. Anybody here heard of The China Study? Probably many hands will go up. Well, so Jeff Proxmire, in about a 2-minute conversation, said enough to interest me in looking at this book, The China Study. Jeff was saying some odd things to my ears, things like dairy and potential connections with health outcomes that aren't great, and things like that. And so I bought the book, and actually I bought the audio version and listened to it over the next, I probably finished it in 2 weeks because it was really very engaging to listen to. It was written by a man named T. Colin Campbell. Perhaps some of you know of him. T. Colin Campbell earned his PhD in nutritional biochemistry in the 1960s. He grew up on a dairy farm, and he got into nutritional biochemistry with the interest of furthering knowledge about how animal protein is very, very healthy for people to ingest. So he had that kind of a background. The name of the book refers to a very large epidemiology study that he had been sort of the primary investigator in. Well, he was the primary investigator, but with lots of help of other professionals. I'm going to tell you about the China study momentarily here, but before we get to the study itself, I want to tell you about an experience that he had had a good 10 or 20 years before he designed this study with the help of others. In the 1960s, there was an outbreak of some sort, you could say, of liver cancer in children in the Philippines. Hepatocellular carcinoma is a cancer that is quite rare in children. It's something that folks who've battled with hepatitis B or hepatitis C, they're prone to it. Other toxin exposures are risk factors for hepatocellular carcinoma, but children just, they don't get it. But they were getting it in the Philippines. And so Dr. Campbell was invited over there to try to figure out what was happening there, what was the cause of these liver cancers in all of these children. And as they studied the situation, they recognized that against their anticipated findings, they discovered that children who were from the more upper socioeconomic levels of the Philippine society were getting more liver cancer than kids from the lower socioeconomic levels. So the families living in some degree of affluence, their children were getting more cancer than kids from other neighborhoods or other parts of the country. Quite against what they had expected to find. Now, to sort it all out, they figured out what was going on. And what was happening there in the Philippines was the presence of a mold called Aspergillus. Aspergillus is a mold that, if you're not careful, it'll grow on things like peanuts or other nuts, or various other produce foods. If they're not properly dried or stored or processed, you may wind up with Aspergillus growing on it. And Aspergillus produces a toxin called aflatoxin. Anybody heard of aflatoxin, maybe? Dr. Larry has. Aflatoxin is made by this mold. It winds up on peanuts if you're not careful. Peanuts are made into peanut butter, and peanut butter is something that kids love to eat. And peanut butter laced with aflatoxin, it turned out, was the cause of this outbreak of liver cancer among Filipino children, affecting richer kids and not so much poor kids. What was the mechanism there? Well, we know that there was some things about this were not surprising. Aflatoxin is a known liver carcinogen, and so it produces evidently some sort of mutation in liver cells that, if unchecked, it will grow and divide and become liver cancer. So, but why were one population of kids who were eating this aflatoxin-laced peanut butter getting cancer, and another population of kids who were eating aflatoxin-laced peanut butter not getting cancer? This is in the mid-60s, and about the same time, a paper came out from some researchers in India who were studying aflatoxin-induced liver cancer in rats. They were exposing rats to aflatoxin and watching as they grew over time, and then were sacrificing them and cutting their livers and looking for tumors and describing what was going on with that. So they were learning about liver cancer in rats. Aflatoxin bothers their liver too. They had a design, an experimental design, where they took the rats, they divided them in half. One group of rats, they fed a diet in which protein made up 5% of the calories. So some kind of a rat chow where protein made up 5% of the calories. The other group of rats were fed a diet in which protein made up 20% of the calories in the rat chow. So what is that? That is a 4 times difference, 5% and 20%. And they let a little time go by as the rats were exposed to aflatoxin, eat the low or the high protein diet, and a number of weeks later kill the rats, cut out their livers. And what they reported was that 100% of the rats who were fed a diet high in protein had liver cancer, advanced liver cancer in their little rat livers. And of the rats who were fed a diet of 5% protein, precisely 0 of them, the same number of weeks or months later, 0 of them had liver cancer. They published this, and anybody who noticed the paper thought, well, these guys, they got the numbers on the cages wrong, or they goofed it up somehow. You don't get 100% to 0% in science. It's never that clean. And so the paper Dr. Campbell noticed this paper and scratched his head, and he and his team, just a few years later in the early 70s, repeated that study. Rats, 20%, 5%, 20%, 5% protein, Quite a difference in protein. That's the only difference in their lives other than that. And lo and behold, liver cancer in the one and not in the other. So then they did the study again, which after a few weeks, the diets are flipped. So a rat that was getting 5% protein is now getting 20%. And some of those rats are sacrificed at that point. Their livers are looked at. Yep, cancers are starting to grow over here. They're not over here. Flip the diets. The rats that are still in those groups and still alive and haven't been sacrificed yet, then more time allowed on the opposite diet. The rats who had been forming liver cancer on 20% diet, now on 5% protein, liver cancers are melting away. The rats that had no liver cancer, you get the point, on 5% protein, now on 20% protein, they're developing. So there was a very clear correlation between protein intake for these rats and the ability of aflatoxin to produce liver cancer. And so, I want to tell you that the protein in their diet, the protein that they were fed was casein, C-A-S-E-I-N. You're familiar with casein is the main protein in milk, cow's milk. So just a graph showing that at over a number of 3, 6, 9, 12 weeks, the red line is the rats fed 20% protein, cancer index going up pretty sharply, the rats taking 5% protein in their diet, protected from aflatoxin-induced liver cancer. And then again, I should have had this up while I was explaining the switching the diet thing. So you could turn on and turn off and turn on and turn off cancer depending on whether you fed a rat 20% protein or 5% protein. Okay, weird stuff. What explains that? At about the same time, over in China, massive country, millions of people, hundreds of millions of people in China, the Chinese scientists were at that same time developing wonderfully detailed maps of the whole Chinese continent and depicting health outcomes in great detail down to the county and down to the village, and creating maps. They produced a publication of some 300 pages with some 500 maps. And this one happens to be liver cancer and how it's distributed throughout China. So lots and lots of liver cancer here and not a smidgen of it here and things like that. And they had all these different maps for throat cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, all these types of outcomes. And what you had was very different rates of these sorts of diseases from different parts of the country in a population with the same genetics, or largely so. And it begged for explanation. So, all right, now comes Colin Campbell, and he had professional friends in Beijing, and he had friends in Oxford, England, and they put together this 20-year study called the Oxford Cornell China Project. 20-year plus, it was NIH funded, so this was taxpayer funded. Thank you very much to your grandparents for their paying taxes. It's the longest and largest epidemiologic study ever conducted. They had nearly 7,000 adults from 65 different counties from across China. It was a huge study in which they sent teams and teams of trained people to go out, conduct investigations with careful questionnaires. They were doing body weight measurements and blood pressures and drawing blood and collecting all that and taking food samples and sending it to lab for careful analysis. It was an incredibly complex study. And by the end of some 20-odd years, they had more than 8,000 statistically significant associations between lifestyle, diet, and diseases. So an awful lot of information to be pawed through. And all through those years, dozens and dozens of papers in scientific journals were coming out describing this and that little piece of that study. By the end of it, Dr. Campbell wrote that book that I showed you a moment ago, The China Study, to sort of describe for a popular public like us what that study, the findings from it. Just some major takeaways. Just a few major takeaways. And what we spoke about with the rats, I think, was very much affirmed in what they found amongst human beings and dietary patterns and intakes and different levels of protein intake, and particularly animal protein. So one of the conclusions of the study was that animal protein promotes the development, growth, and spread of cancer. That's different from saying that animal protein causes cancer. But in the rat study, you had a carcinogen, which was powerless as a carcinogen if the rat was on a relatively low protein diet, and it was a very effective carcinogen if the rat was getting enough casein in his diet. And the more they studied the mechanisms of that, looking for the different pathways within the cell, growth factors, and turning on gene transcription and things like that, every step they looked at, they found that animal protein tended to promote mutations, promote the initiation of a cancer cell, a malignant cell, promote its division and growth into multiple cells, and further to promote the spreading of those cells throughout a person's body, the so-called metastasis state of cancer. Part of the data that the study generated, and many other studies from around the world, is depicted in this graph. If you could see across the bottom, you would read Hungary, USA, Belgium, Sweden, Finland, Portugal, Venezuela, Greece, Mexico, Korea, Thailand, and Laos along the x-axis. Along the y-axis is percent of deaths from the two main killers of Western countries, that is heart disease and cancer. And along the bottom of the x-axis from left to right, you have increasing amount of whole food plant-based nutrition. So in a nutshell, that's whole grains and beans and lentils and legumes and fruits and berries and things like that. And this is what we would, of course, call an association. There's a sharp association from low to high intake of plant nutrition with a dropping incidence of death from heart disease and cancer. Association studies like this do not prove causation. You can't look at that and say, aha, plants, the absence of plants in the diet causes you to get heart disease or die of cancer. You can't go that far with an association study, but it tells you an awful lot about where you should look next, what questions you should ask next for figuring out the risk factors for heart disease and cancer. Back to the major takeaways of the Cornell-Oxford China project. They feel that they proved that poor nutrition is a greater threat to our health than, let's say, the presence of pesticides or other carcinogens. Pesticides, after all, cause cancer by inducing a mutation in a cell, which if that cell isn't killed off by the immune system in time, it grows, becomes cancer. The rats in similar studies show that, again, I've said it before, carcinogens are able to act as carcinogens in the right nutritional environment and are unable in a better nutritional environment. Third major takeaway, heart disease can be reversed through nutrition. Heart disease can be reversed through nutrition. Now, I want to say that this information was already in the scientific literature when I went through school and a residency, and definitely by the time I was in fellowship, this was 10 or 20 years old already. And I didn't hear any of this in my training. And I'm not complaining, I'm not saying somebody did me wrong, I'm not saying I was lied to or misled, but the system in which I was educated, in one way or another, kept this information from me, or perhaps they tried to tell me and I didn't listen, maybe I thought it was boring. I don't know. But let me show you what this means. Heart disease can be reversed through nutrition. This, as you may know, is an angiogram of a person's heart arteries. The coronary arteries, of course, are the arteries that give the heart itself, the heart muscle itself, supply it with blood, oxygen, and so on. Our heart muscle is a very metabolically active tissue. Of course, it's been bumping for you since you were, 8 weeks gestation. And it's still working because you have coronary arteries that bring blood to the heart muscle. Now, this is a coronary angiogram on a 33-year-old, I think, man who was having chest pain. And sure enough, angiogram, they shoot dye in the arteries, they take pictures, and here you see beautiful blood flow, lovely strictured and ratty and very poor blood flow. It's obvious from across the room. This person has severe coronary artery disease of his left anterior descending coronary artery, and he was advised, you need to let us take you to bypass surgery. We'll bypass that artery for you. You'll be good as new. I think he was a physician, this particular patient, and he decided he didn't want to do that. He'd heard a little bit about these things about the China project, and he decided he was not going to have a coronary artery bypass graft. nor was he going to take a cholesterol-lowering drug. His cholesterol was quite high. He somehow had it in his head, crazy guy, he had it in his head that you could heal this by eating differently and exercising more and taking care of your health. So the doctors let him go, thinking, well, he'll be dead in 6 months. He'll be back with acute coronary event. Well, 32 months later, the same man, after 32 months on a plant-based diet and without cholesterol-lowering drugs, something has healed that left anterior descending coronary artery. And what healed it was the body's own beautiful programmed wisdom for knowing how to set itself right once we get out of the way of our own healing capabilities and allow the body to do what God designed it to do, which is to promote health and well-being. So here's a guy who avoided coronary artery bypass graft surgery by eating differently. And we know of dozens and dozens we know of many, many other cases. There are case studies showing pretty much the same thing. That's what it means when we say plant-based nutrition can reverse heart disease. That's just one example. Oftentimes, if we're talking about plant nutrition, we will be quick to point out that whole food plant nutrition is the main source of energy comes from carbohydrate. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans and lentils, those are high in carbohydrate. All of those foods are. And so you might often be asked, well, aren't carbohydrates unhealthy? There's a lot of talk these days about low carbohydrate, low carb diets, or ketogenic diets, or carnivore diets, and things where the carbohydrate intake is either low or very low. And we have to keep in mind that carbohydrates is a big category. Carbohydrates is a big umbrella, and underneath that umbrella is table sugar and celery sticks with all the fiber that's in it. That's carbohydrate. So if someone asks you about eating carbohydrate, we want to ask quickly, which carbohydrate do you mean? The processed, refined stuff that we've taken and split out the fiber from, we've pulled the bran off the wheat product, we've removed the germ, and we're left with refined simple carbs, or do we mean complex carbohydrates which kind of grew out of the ground the way God designed them to grow? Very different things, and very different outcomes or results come from eating them. So just some nice examples. We looked at some refined carbs. Now we've got some good complex carbs. So we've got legumes, some different kinds of lentils, some beans here, some peas in a pod. We have whole grains, so I can't tell what things are from looking at them. My wife knows these things, but old-fashioned oatmeal, quinoa, millet, there's dozens and dozens of different sorts of grains, whole grains, and starchy vegetables, all sources of complex carbohydrates. Don't they pretty much look like they would have looked when they came out of the ground? That's right. Another question that is very often raised about for people who want to promote plant nutrition and very low animal protein intake is, well, where do you get your protein? Where do you get your protein? We've kind of been sort of trained in a way by our culture to think of an equation between protein and meat. I should have asked you, if I said, when I say the word protein, what comes to your mind? And maybe most of you would say, well, different kinds of meat, chicken, beef. Maybe beef is the most famous example. Protein equals meat, we've all been taught. Well, I suppose you could ask one of these gentlemen where they get their protein. Now, on the left there is, of course, a gorilla. I guess there are different kinds of gorillas, and he's some kind of a gorilla. And, well, gorillas are famous. What are they famous for? They're famous for, like, biting your leg off if you make them mad, or ripping you apart. They're famous for being incredibly strong. And I think you can see by looking at him, he's a muscular dude. Herbivore. Gorillas eat plants. The living things, the living beings that they eat are ants. They might eat some ants or some other little bugs. Gorillas get their protein from plants. Rhinoceros, total herbivore. It eats nothing but plants. In fact, I didn't notice it, but he's got dinner right there just came, maybe he's munching on it. Something green in that rhinoceros mouth. A big muscular beast, a lot more protein than you'll ever hope to have. The point is that there is more than adequate protein in plants. It was something I didn't expect to discover, but it's the fact. One more graph to show you. This is another association. When I was a kid, there was an ad campaign for dairy, paid for by the dairy industry, no doubt, and the little tagline was, does anybody know what I'm thinking of? Advertisement for milk, and they would say, milk does a body good. That's exactly right. And we've all grown up with the idea that, well, milk there's a lot of calcium in milk. And so the thought has been for many, many years, well, you must drink your milk if you want strong bones. I was told that as a kid. Drink your milk, you'll need strong bones. And there is a lot of calcium in milk. And at the same time, when you look at, this is a study of 40 different countries around the world. Each one of these blue dots is a different country. And along the x-axis, once again here, is from low to high increasing intake of dairy consumption. And on the y-axis, hip fracture rates. And it shows quite clearly, a statistician would tell you a correlation coefficient of 0.85 is about as close to a perfect correlation as you'll get in biology. And again, it's just an association. This does not tell you that dairy gives you a hip fracture. But it darn well tells you that if dairy is supposed to protect you from hip fractures, it's doing a pretty bad job, because of the fact that hip fractures are sky high in countries where dairy intake is high. Association studies are very useful. It's prospective studies in which we decide ahead of time what we're going to measure, what outcome we're looking for, and then allow time to pass. That's the sort of study that you need to really show causality for the most part. But the evidence is pretty strong. In fact, Dr. Campbell and his colleagues, by the end of their 20-odd years or more than that in their professions, concluded that evidence shows that a whole food, plant-based diet prevents, suspends, and or cures all of the following. And these are all from peer-reviewed research findings: cancers, cardiovascular diseases, multiple sclerosis, kidney stones, osteoporosis, diabetes both 1 and 2, I'm going to come back to that in a second, rheumatoid arthritis, obesity, macular degeneration, hypertension, acne, migraine headaches, lupus, depression, Alzheimer's, cognitive dysfunction, and mostly anecdotal evidence showing that pain, syndromes, and erectile dysfunction can be prevented, reversed, or cured with a whole food, plant-based nutrition. I just want to tell you that type 1 diabetes, I'm an endocrinologist, so I have to dilate on that for a moment here. Type 1 diabetes, as you know, is used to be called childhood onset diabetes. It's now called type 1 diabetes. And what that disease is, of course, is the slow or rapid destruction of a person's beta cells in their pancreas. It's the beta cells that make insulin. And if you lose your beta cells, you've lost your insulin, and you've got type 1 diabetes, and you'll die in hours if you don't get insulin. Whole food plant-based diet doesn't make your beta cells come back. It doesn't restore your pancreas health. It doesn't cure type 1 diabetes in that sense. But it's very clear that whole food plant-based nutrition dramatically increases a person's body's insulin sensitivity, which means that a person with type 1 diabetes who moves to a plant-based diet, maybe they're requiring 50 units of insulin per day before the dietary change, and after they're on whole food plant-based diet, they might be getting by very, very well on 20 units per day. Better blood sugar control, less than half as much insulin. That kind of thing is what we see when we occasionally persuade somebody to adopt this kind of nutrition. All right, so I want to just tell you that this sort of information was, again, actually, if you had asked me before Jeff Proxmire told me I should go look at the China study, if you had asked me, tell me about nutrition, what's good to eat, how should I eat, I'm almost certain I would have said, well, eat a healthy diet. You're good, eat a healthy diet. And if they had said, what does that mean? I probably would have said, I suppose probably what my mom fed me. I don't, I suppose. I think we're pretty healthy, and you are what you eat. That would have come to mind. Yeah, you are what you eat. I think that's true. I'm not sure what that means. I had almost no interest in nutrition, going through all that fancy training and so on. And once again, it's so interesting to me that could be the case, that this sort of dietary change can be so, the evidence can be so overwhelmingly strong that this sort of nutrition can reverse these sorts of diseases. But one thing that Dr. Campbell helped me to understand from the China study was that the way our medical education is put together and financed and supported, more and more in the last decades, 100 years probably, more and more our education is supported by industries that have something to gain from doctors thinking this way and not that way. You follow what I'm saying, don't you? There's an awful lot of money in healthcare. We're going to get to that in a moment here. And it turns out that what I was taught to think was strongly influenced by a company with $1 to make. Lots of companies with lots of dollars to make. Now, finally, we get to where we can give credit to where it's due. And you're familiar with these words. Of course, we read in our Bibles, page 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And there's quite a little bit of information about nutrition in Genesis, which had flown past my head always until this. And so we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 11 and 12, and God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their own seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And then we read, "And then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female. He created them. And God blessed them. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth I have given every green plant for food." Now, I had to kind of look into this to kind of get clear on what these differences are. Evidently, when man and woman were first created, we were told that fruit trees and nuts and berries, legumes actually would fit into this category, so beans and lentils, and whole grains would fit into this original diet. And then the other animals were given things like lettuce and grass and things like that to eat. So there was some difference there initially. What happens next? Okay, this is part of the same story here. "Out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food." This is Genesis chapter 2 account of creation. "The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God blessed them." I guess I have 2 slides of that. And now we have the fall. Now, what happened at the fall? Did you know that nutrition, God's words about nutrition, changed immediately at the fall? And just after Adam and Eve have eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, part of God's words to Adam is, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field." This is what he had said were for the animals prior to the fall. Now, at the time of the fall, we are now told we should also be eating kale and spinach and leafy vegetables and so on. An odd change there. For the reasons, I don't know what the reasons are, but actually I did want to tell you that now that your kids, if you have any kids and they're over in Sabbath school, if your kids say to you, it wasn't until the fall that we were told to eat vegetables, leafy vegetables, and so really I shouldn't have to eat these vegetables, right? They can point at their Bibles and say to you, "Gotcha." And I just want to tell you that you can say, "Yes, that's right, and that's exactly why you need them." And so eat your vegetables. So don't fall for that trick your kids might play. Now, one more thing to tell you about Genesis and nutrition. We've had the flood. Noah and his family, his 3 sons and their wives, have emerged from the ark, and we have sort of a creation part 2.0 where God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. All the animals are kind of going to be afraid of you. Why? Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and as I gave you the green plants, now I give you everything. I don't know the reasons for this. I'd be interested in anyone's thoughts, but for some reason, at the time of the flood and just after it, God advised his people, you can now eat meat. Maybe it was from necessity. Maybe there wasn't enough gardens growing after the flood. For whatever reason, animal protein was officially sort of sanctioned by God, I think as some kind of an emergency measure. And isn't it interesting to note that the ages of the patriarchs, so we have Adam on the far side, and right on down the line, his son and his son's son and his son's son's son, and you have Methuselah, 969 years at his death. Noah lived nearly as long. Noah's got his ark. And then you've got Shem and Shem's offspring, and these are 100-year increments of lifespan, and then there's me and you down here. Now, I find it interesting. I'm not trying to say that the addition of animal protein to the diet was the cause of this. Wouldn't try to argue that. I'm sure that the reasons for this sort of precipitous drop-off in lifespan had probably lots of reasons, but it's interesting that animal protein was added at that point. Well, this is the graph, and we're nearly done. This is the graph that you would need your opera glasses for, but what this is proof to you and me, if we needed any, that something is wrong in the healthcare system of our country, and that is depicted here. What we have along the bottom is healthcare expenditures per capita, so dollars spent per person in a country on healthcare per year for the United States and for Spain, Italy, South Korea, Australia, France, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, Japan, Belgium. You get the point. From 1970 to 2018, and finally, on the left y-axis up here, you have life expectancy. So the average Israeli lives about 82 years and 10 months. The average German lives about 81 years. The average American, as of since 2014, is living less long than we did even 10 years ago, at less than 79 years on average, at $10,000 per person per year, whereas the Spaniards are getting about a fifth of that spent on their health per year, and they're living a lot longer. I don't know what else to say about that other than it's graphic and dramatic, and I suppose the last 3 years, if we needed evidence that something was broken in our way of delivering health care, the last 3 years was a pretty good depiction. One last thing on this. I wanted to make one more point. So if you got the glycolysis pathway and the products of that go into get oxidized. This is, again, the breaking down of glucose to get its energy out of it. That little bitty graph there fits in right here. That's glycolysis, and then you have the tricarboxylic acid cycle. And then you've got all these scads and myriads of other pathways of biochemistry that have to do with amino acid flux and energy disposition and burning and creating fatty acids, and all of these ways in which our bodies know how to interact and get things done. And good luck if you're going to try to design that from a little bit of dirt and some pressure and temperature and time, in my opinion. It's impossible to expect to evolve this over any length of time. And the other thing I'll say about it is that, as we almost close, the medical model that we now sort of have grown up with hinges on the idea that, we understand this reaction here, and we want less of that and more of this, and how about that? We've figured out a drug that interrupts that pathway right there, and we'll sell it to you for quite a lot of money, and we'll keep a patent on it for 20-odd years so that you can't make a generic of it, and we'll make bank, and you'll have the health outcomes that we just saw on the previous graph. The point I'm making here is that that kind of a reductionist approach to health and approach to biochemistry gets us what it is we've got. Poor health outcomes at high expenditures, lots of adverse effects. The point is the system is much more delicate and capable than that. If we get out of our own way and live and eat in such a way that promotes this, we do well. I just wanted to show this one last time. No, I don't. I'm going to move right on from that. I want to say one more thing to you, and that is this. So I'm really impressed with this information. And it has changed the way I eat and the way Olya eats, but even though I'm fully convinced in my mind about what to eat and what not to eat, pretty regularly I have to resist a temptation, and I tell you what, Umpqua chocolate ice cream is like, I've never had cocaine, but it's it's criminally good. Umpqua chocolate ice cream, and I'm convinced it's bad for a bunch of ways we didn't go into today. What I mean to say to you is this, that I am not at all telling you what you ought to eat, or that you need to think like I do, or that I know more than you. There are some things here maybe I'm more familiar with, and I struggle at times. I probably had a hamburger less than a month ago, and enjoyed it, and then felt guilty. I have 2 documentary films that I just want to make sure you know about, and they're both a few years old now. One is called Forks Over Knives. Probably many of you have seen this or heard of it. Forks Over Knives is so well done. It actually tells Dr. Colin Campbell's story along with another eminent physician, Caldwell Esselstyn. Wonderfully well done. And they pick this, what you've got at the end of your fork is going to be much more valuable to your health than a surgeon's scalpel. And then another really good film called What the Health. I think you can tell from the title it's a little edgy. What the Health? And what they're after in What the Health is you see this hamburger with dollar bills and pills, and they're making the point that the money is flowing that way, the pills are flowing that way, and we're dying like never before. You should see What the Health if you'd like a good documentary film on nutrition. One thing I like about it is they do a wonderful job of showing real-life people from point A to point B in time, many, many chronic health issues at this point, and at some later point on half as many or less drugs, much healthier, longer lifespan to be expected because of changes in nutrition. It can occur. And then lastly, nutritionfacts.org. I love to put a plug in for Michael Greger. I find his website very helpful. Ultimately, though, we ought to give thanks to our God whenever we have something to eat. There are people in the world who do not have anything to eat tonight. And if you have something to eat today and tonight, then we all ought to praise God for that. And so whether we eat or drink, or whatever we eat or drink, whatever we do, let us resolve to do it to the glory of the God who gives us these things, who gives us our daily bread. Thank you.